Distracting.
Chart, sorry.
Okay, welcome everyone. Happy Halloween. Today we'll be talking about storytelling. So there's going to be like a lot of videos and interactive things and so on to follow along. So I think this is going to be a fun lecture. Before I start, administratively, you saw probably that we posted on Slack that we are set up Canvas groups. We first tried that you guys self-set up Canvas groups, but it turns out we can't actually grade you with those self-set-up groups. And so we had to set them up, but please, like in the future, it doesn't really mean all that much to you. It's just for us a way to kind of like grade all of you and give you feedback as a group instead of individually and us having to copy everything over. Just make sure that you're in the right group. And then I also posted if there are any issues with your group, please do come and see me or send me an email sooner rather than later. These things can often be resolved before it gets really tricky. So just like definitely a recommendation that you should come and speak up about any conflicts that you have within a group so that you can resolve them early. There will be like a peer feedback survey at the end of the project where you will be asked to rate yourself and to rate all of your peers that you work with in your team. And in the worst case scenario, we'll like change grades for individual team members. Any questions about either of those? Okay, if not, so today we'll be talking about storytelling. As you remember, we really want you to do some storytelling in your project. We also have like a little storytelling component, like the simplest possible version in homework 6. And I just want to kind of like talk a little bit more formally about what does it mean to do storytelling with data visualizations. And so I want to start off with this particular video, which is a couple of minutes, but I think it's worth watching.
I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor, there's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly. The notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream, keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here's the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much grain in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Okay. So what do you think?
You need to put it on a log scale because it's just running right off the chart.
So the comment is we need to put it on a log scale. Why do you think they didn't do that?
Because most people don't think on a log scale.
Yeah, exactly. Like they want to make a point. This is off the charts, right? And if you put that on a log scale, well, maybe a scientist would have an easier time analyzing it, but not this. Like that wasn't the point of the story, I would say, right?
They're really going hard with music and the grayed out text. They're really trying to make it dismal.
Yes. So they set a mood, right? This is like and also the narration, like the intonation of the voice. You can't really argue with the charts, the visual encodings. Are there any like bad visual encodings in there? I didn't spot anything that I would necessarily object to from a purely like analytical perspective, right? If you just analyze those charts, it seems to be like pretty well done, right? But the question is, like, what is the point of this video? Is it to inform people? Yes?
He has to persuade or sell a viewpoint about the wealth inequality.
Exactly. There is like clearly the narrator has an agenda, right? It's not. This isn't like a neutral description of the data, but it's an attempt at persuading somebody. And is that effective? What do you think? It's a pretty effective video, right? But it clearly has like, even if you like the intonation, that Reddit socialism. Any other thoughts on this chart? Yeah.
I really like that there were multiple different types of visualizations, even when they were showing the CEO what they were making in an hour. That was also a visualization. I think just really drilling down all these different ways of representing the same data was
Yeah.
effective.
Notice the trick that they did, like this transitioning from this abstract bar chart to essentially going to an isotype representation. to make it more relatable. And I think that like if this were some kind of like abstract representation, it might not be quite as convincing. Like if these were just line charts, I don't think it would make the point quite as strongly as they did.
Can the chart go negative when you have like negative wealth? Because I
Yes.
don't know if the bottom is quite right.
Yeah, so you could definitely have negative wealth, so you could have more debt. I guess
So this doesn't seem to be shown in the chart.
it's not, no, that's a good point. So I haven't like checked the data, but they actually point to sources at the end of it, right? So I wouldn't necessarily completely trust this visualization, but I also would trust it enough that I think they probably are not off by far. But it would be interesting to like, you need to go back and look at it. So there could be something like negative wealth, which like definitely happens, right? There was actually like a story about that yesterday by Nathan Yao. He looked at, there's this kind of like, somebody, like some business report quoted that by the age, or like millennials have, like 1 out of 6 millennials have more than $100,000 in value, right? And so he analyzed this data, and he showed that a lot of millennials actually have negative wealth, but it's not all that far off if you consider all the assets, including houses. I'll post a link to this later. So yeah, technically, this video, how would you approach that? Yeah. Yeah, so you might have to like really do some After Effects and Illustrator magic there. That isn't really easy to implement, but I think you can probably get fairly close with an interactive data story. Maybe like not the little animations of the people working around when you resort them, right? That might be tricky. And also the narration, the voice, like that makes a lot of like telling a story by a narrator is always a little bit more effective than just putting in text, right? Because you can like emphasize points differently. So I think it would be cool if you could like make data visualizations as engaging as this, but this is clearly like something where you need a lot of custom work. So why am I showing this? Because like we're talking today about storytelling, and storytelling, like somebody called it the world's second oldest profession. And what is storytelling really about? It's more about, it's not just about providing facts and data, but it's also about situating what you're telling and giving context. You need to engage an audience. You need to educate. And the typical questions that you would ask in any story is like, who, what, where, when, why, how. And so like this is just like a typical arc that isn't specific to data stories or visualization of any story. You have like an introduction, you have a problem that you need to face, you have some climax, you have some resolution, and some conclusion. And that's kind of like a pattern that is also useful. Like you can see some of this in the story that we just saw, right? So the conclusion is kind of like a call to action or a call to like just realize how skewed this is in the previous story. Whereas the climax is probably the reveal of the actual distribution compared to what people think it is and what the ideal distribution would be. And so why do we do storytelling with data? Why don't we just like present the data neutrally? Well, it's because we often want to we want to make an argument and we want to underscore that with data and facts. And visualization is really good at that because we can show things like trends that are really hard to describe. We can show correlation, we can show outliers, and we can convey magnitudes. Like this off the charts example that we saw with like the top 1%, how they had to stack all of this cash is a good example of that. And another good example of that is the video, An Inconvenient Truth. I'm assuming that some of you have seen that, but I just want to show this like one interesting sequence of this.
Compared to what's going on now,
This is Al Gore.
there's just no comparison. So if you look at 1,000 years worth of temperature and compare it to 1,000 years of CO2, you can see how closely they fit together. Now, 1,000 years of CO2 In the mountain glaciers, that's one thing. But in Antarctica, they can go back 650,000 years. This, incidentally, is the first time anybody outside of a small group of scientists has seen this image. This is the present day era, and that's the last ice age. Then it goes up. We're going back in time now, 650,000 years. That's the period of warming between the last two ice ages. That's the second and third ice age back, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh ice age back. Now, an important point. In all of this time, 650,000 years, the CO2 level has never gone above 300 parts per million. Now, as I said, they can also measure temperature. Here's what the temperature has been on our Earth. Now, one thing that kind of jumps out at you is, well, let me put it this way. If my classmate from the 6th grade that talked about Africa and South America were here, he would say, did they ever fit together? Most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. But they did, of course. And the relationship is actually very complicated. But there is one relationship that is far more powerful than all the others, and it is this. When there is more carbon dioxide, the temperature gets warmer because it traps more heat from the sun inside. In the parts of the United States that contain the modern cities of Cleveland, Detroit, New York, in the northern tier, this is the difference between a nice day and having a mile of ice over your head. Keep that in mind when you look at this fact. Carbon dioxide, having never gone above 300 parts per million, here is where CO2 is now. Way above where it's ever been as far back as this record will measure. Now, if you'll bear with me, I want to really emphasize this point. The crew here has tried to teach me how to use this contraption here. So if I don't kill myself, I'll... It's already right here. Look how far above the natural cycle this is. And we've done that. But ladies and gentlemen, in the next 50 years, really in less than 50 years, it's going to continue to go up. When some of these children who are here are my age, here's what it's going to be in less than 50 years. You've heard of off the charts. Within less than 50 years, it'll be here. There's not a single fact or date or number that's been used to make this up that's in any controversy. The so-called skeptics look at this and they say, so, that seems perfectly okay. Well, again, if on the temperature side, if this much on the cold side is a mile of ice over our heads, what would that much on the warm side be? Ultimately, this is really not a political issue so much as a moral issue. If we allow that to happen, it is deeply unethical.
Okay, so what do you think about this data story?
Aren't we supposed to get a foot or a little lift
What?
for our visualization? We don't
Oh yeah. The use of the prop is quite compelling, right? So, and I was like, it's clearly very well created, right? This is made like to create a video about it, and like there's a lot of special made, even a display ball they built just for this, where they can show something like that. Any other thoughts?
I think the way that they had the visualization displayed was specifically crafted to give a really big sense of scale. stretch out these, thousands of years across the screen, like we already talked about. We use this
Yeah,
to raise up to
exactly.
that point.
Anybody have any concerns about the visualization that he used here?
So this is kind of a critique of both visualizations. I feel like when you present data without understanding the methods behind it, if you're not a critical thinker, it's not that bad. But in this case, with the CO2, for example, usually with these graphs, they're concatenating two different data sources together. So one is ice cores, the other is actual CO2 concentration. The other one with the money, they make the perception that it's actually cached, when in reality it could just be marketplace valuation. So providing this data without context can actually, I think, be detrimental to the point you're trying to make, because somebody who wants to critically think about this isn't able to. And so you can immediately jump onto the bandwagon against these type of visualizations. That's kind of my opinion.
Anybody have an opinion on this? Sure.
But I think just presenting all the techniques behind all of this is very unrealistic, and it's almost impossible for anyone else to understand how they predicted the CO2 value in 50 years as well. Like, even if they presented it, how are we going to understand if we're not domain scientists? You know what I mean? So it's like, if we choose to believe this, then yes, like it makes a point. But if we choose not to believe it, there's really nothing to do about it. It's like a belief system almost. It's like, really, do you believe in these domain scientists, in what they're saying? If you don't, then what are you doing?
Yeah, so it's basically a question of trust, right? Like that, it's essentially a question of knowledge. Like, what do we know for a fact? Like we can simply no longer know everything. We cannot actually trace back the source of everything. Like, for example, even that the Earth isn't flat is something that isn't all that easy to reconstruct. Like, you can do an experiment yourself and you can convince yourself, but you really have to think hard about it, right? And so, like, at which point do you delegate trust to somebody else? This is like a good question. You had a comment there?
In that kind of vein, these are kind of intended as overviews, and maybe at the beginning of a paper, be like, okay, this is what we're talking about here, but then the rest of the papers isn't presented because that's not the target audience.
Yeah.
So that, and then you just have to trust that the people presenting this to you actually did go through and do the rest of it. My other thought was that the presentation of world temperature on the scale of parts per million was a little odd to me. And he did go in and explain that, okay, and this distance is a mile of ice over your head, but they didn't show the scale. So he had to make that comment, and then it was just kind of confusing.
Yeah, so that would be a criticism that I would have about this chart, is that it uses like a line chart with two axes, which is kind of tricky. But of course, it's understandable why they did this, because they have these nice patterns, but you can fiddle with those scales to make it fit better and worse. So it's not completely clear that this is objective. Yeah?
Kind of along with that, at the end, he's saying, imagine what the temperature is going to be, but it doesn't show you what the predicted temperature is going to be. It makes me wonder, maybe it's not that dramatic at this scale, or...
That's a good question, yeah. This video is also a little bit older, like I think 2008 or so, or 10. So I don't know, but that's a good point. Yeah, they don't really show what the current, like, you don't see like a bump in temperature, which we actually observe now, and you don't see any prediction of temperature. Yeah?
So just a rebuttal. So anyway, so I think the problem with these data visualizations is if there's a chink in your armor, then people who oppose your message are going to seize upon that, and they're going to exploit the weakness in your data. And when they do that, then you run the risk of losing your credibility if they're able to make a better story out of how inaccurate your data visualization actually is. So that's.
But how would you then tell that story, right?
I mean, so this is obviously talking to a liberal audience.
Why?
And if somebody's in a conservative audience, right, then they could see on this.
Why is this a liberal? Like, why did you identify this as a liberal audience?
This is, I mean, it's outdoor.
Okay, that's a good point. So, this is actually something that I wanted to bring out. Is it a great idea to have a politician tell this story? Like, it's basically going to have this immediate adversarial reaction, right, from the other party.
Well, I think also the other video, when they say like a Reddit socialism, like I think in some ways having such a harsh, not harsh, but like a strong opinion and like bias discounts your video or your story to so many people, because as soon as you say that, they're like, oh, this person doesn't have enough views, I shouldn't listen to this or something. So I think, like, in some ways, just presenting the data as facts and not having such a strong bias probably takes away from the like, strength of your story, but at the same time makes it viewable to everyone.
Yeah, so you probably, like, especially with this video, you kind of like preach to the choir, right?
Yeah.
You might not be able to convince a conservative audience with that. There you had a comment?
There were more like original ideas, but I think sort of for that conversation that's happening there, maybe the issue isn't so much the domain of experts, but rather people that don't have data literacy and how they're interpreting. Because once you get into storytelling with Viz, you're going to be putting a perspective on it. And to your point, I think it can be polarizing depending on who's telling it, or it could be just misguided if it's a really compelling story. And we looked at all those charts with like the office sales, and those are more obviously manipulated, but when you have such a structured argument and presentation, people are less likely to question whether it's presenting it accurately.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Any other comments before we move on? Yeah.
So it seems like data visualization has like an underlying assumption that we care about facts, but what happens if we live in a post-fact world? Like, wouldn't it be like cheaper and easier just to put lies on the screen and
yeah,
and then we just.
I think, yeah, that's a good point. I don't know whether you want to go there, right? But I think that one of the things about data visualization, and like I try to always emphasize this when we talk about designing visualizations, is like you can easily lie with visualization. There's like books on how to lie with statistics. There is like seminars on how to lie with visualization. So it doesn't, like, just data visualization doesn't guarantee it's right. It doesn't say it's a fact. You still have to use your critical judgment to evaluate what are the sources, who is telling the story, do they have an agenda, and only if you integrate all of this information can you really evaluate whether you should trust something. And I think this is the same about data visualization or reading an essay, right? You always have to be critical and just check whether this is reasonable, whether they are transparent about what they're telling you, and whether they give you an opportunity to fact check. Okay. So I want to go into like a little bit of different medium. Like we had 2 videos now, but of course data storytelling isn't just about videos or interactive websites. You can also do amazing infographics. And so here's an infographic. Any baseball fans in here? 1, 2. Okay, so this is a New York Times piece from a while ago. Basically, there's this question about whether this guy, Barry Bonds, who was like an exceptional athlete or is an exceptional athlete, but suddenly had an amazing spike in home runs per season. And so there was a lot of allegations that he was actually taking steroids, and that steroids are the cause of this amazing spike. And this data story kind of like investigates this. So like, let's take apart this data story, this infographic. This is something that you would see in print, right? So you have like, the first thing is that you see is like a big title, which kind of gives you an introduction. 7, 505, this is how many home runs he hit. steroids or not, the pursuit is on. And so that kind of already tells you, like, okay, we're going to see a comparison between this one guy and two other people who are like known to be like great batters. And so the next thing that we see here is we get some context and legend. So this isn't just like a line chart or anything like that, right? This is heavily annotated, uses a lot of additional information, and even uses images, right? We have Barry Bonds here in like a large image, and then we have two players to compare to, Hank Aaron and Babe Ruth, and how many home runs they hit over their careers and how many seasons they played. So then next we have the main story, which is kind of like this trajectory. And so this is like over their career, how many like home runs in total did they hit? And in this, along this main story, we have annotations of a key point. And this is going to be a little bit hard to read because this is meant to be like on paper, close reading. But what this annotation here is says that there's a book about Bonds that he started taking steroids around this time. And you can suddenly see that the steepness of the curve around this time changes rapidly, right? So you see that he is suddenly on a trajectory that never, like, that none of these other two people ever had. So that's kind of like kind of underscoring the argument. So we have this inflection point in his trajectory, and that correlates with the accusation of him taking steroids at this point. And then here we have another example where he takes over, just after the intersection point where he takes over. And then we keep going with more context. So this is kind of like the idea here is not to just tell this one particular story, but to also give you like more information and to engage you and to drill down into something. So here it's basically like at this point he was like pretty old already, and then this goes into details about how is the pace of hitting home runs keeping up after the age of 34 in those people's careers. Then we have even more contextual information. Right? Down here we have other players and how their career developed, and then here we have like young players that are like outside of this trajectory, that are not yet there to be interesting in terms of absolute numbers, but that have a shot at kind of overtaking this. And so like all of these different layers of this story are kind of like really well arranged to really like first draw your interest in, give you a lot of information, and then allow you to investigate deeper if you're interested. And so I really want to emphasize like this, like if we just built this in D3 and showed those line charts without any of those annotations, this wouldn't be a particularly compelling story, right? Somebody really sat down and thought a lot about this and annotated this and really like structured this very consciously. So why do you think they, like this, these are bar charts or histograms essentially, or bar charts of these home runs. Why do you think they chose to do these bar charts here instead of what line charts in the other examples? Any ideas? Yeah.
You probably want to draw your focus into like those three lines on the line chart, and having more of them on the bottom might confuse what you're supposed to focus on. So the bar charts, since they're kind of grayed out and at the bottom, they're interesting, but they're less important than what you're thinking.
Yeah, so it's contextual information. That might be a good reason. Any other thoughts?
Having them all be roughly that same like linear looking curve, you couldn't tell much of a difference between them that small.
Yeah, that's a good point. It would be hard to, like in the small, thing, it would be fairly hard to tell the difference. One other thing that might be the reason that they chose this is we have a lot of like variation here in these people's careers. Like we have Barry Bonds actually is on here, so you see this massive outlier, and that this outlier isn't quite as evident here, right? Or you see like these negative outliers. This is probably when people were injured, right? So that would be like a flat curve, but in the case of having these bars for every season, you see this strong drop. So it's just a different way of framing this, but it tells a little bit of a different story. So what do you think about this? This is a well-designed data story? Any critiques?
Are they trying to make the point that you did do steroids or did not, or you don't know?
That's a good question. I think they're trying to let the reader decide. I actually didn't follow up. This is also a couple of years old, right? So we might know more about this. But I'm guessing that they are basically saying, here's the accusation, and here is the data, and you can make your own judgment. Like, who believes that he took steroids based on this chart? One person. Who believes he did not? 2 people. So a lot of people don't care about this one. Okay. I want to take it again a step back and talk a little bit about types of data stories. This is from a paper by Segel and Hare, and they kind of analyzed lots of different data stories, so both online and on videos, YouTube, and in print. And they identified 7 genres, like magazine style, annotated charts, partition poster, flowchart, comic strip, slideshow, film, video, animation. So what like the ones we've seen so far, where do they fit? Like, what's the wealth inequality? Film, video, also the Al Gore story about climate change is also film, video, right? And the last one that I just showed, annotated chart or magazine style, annotated chart, partition poster. What is it? Yeah, I would argue it's partition poster, right? It's not just a single chart that is annotated. We'll talk more about what those mean, but it's like we have multiple messages, and that's what a partition poster is. I think that you can also think about this as like a continuum of like how much agency does like a reader or a viewer have. You have like the one extreme that is completely author-driven, where the whole message is controlled, and then you have the other extreme, which is completely reader-driven, where you have just data and let people explore, but you can still tell a story. And so this, like the videos are clearly very author-driven. Like you don't have an option of choosing in your order, or like skipping something is kind of tedious to do. Like a poster, as we just saw it, is fairly author-driven, but you still have the option to kind of like jump ahead and read something else, like not necessarily in the order that they intended. And then you have some very reader-driven examples. So this one here is like, I think, a great example of a reader-driven story. Has anybody seen this? This is like a couple of people. This is from the 2012 election. This was actually done by Mike Bostock when he was working as a graphics editor at the New York Times. So what this chart shows us is basically what are the different scenarios in which Obama or Romney can win the 2012 presidential election. And it's kind of like a branching tree, right? You can say, okay, if Obama wins Florida, then there's only like then there's the left branch, which is immediately over. If he also wins Ohio, then he wins. But if he loses Ohio, then there's all of this, the whole story. And so, like, notice that you have this these annotations that appear on hover, and you can kind of reveal this information and kind of play with your own assumptions. So, for example, you can say, hey, I think that Florida is going to go Republican. I think that North Carolina is going to go Republican. And this dynamically adjusts the whole story, right? So this is like probably the most interactive example of data visualization that I've ever seen on a newspaper, where you can really kind of pick your own things very carefully. And so for author or reader-driven, there's like 3 different types of author and reader-driven. There's kind of like what they call the martini glass structure, where you start with an author-driven story and then open it up for the reader to explore in more depth. You can have interactive slideshows, where you kind of split the story into multiple scenes and allow interaction midway, and then but you can then always continue with like the narrated piece. or you could have a drill down story. So here are 3 examples. I want to show those. So this is like a periscopic piece, and they show U.S. gun death in 2013 and use this, at this point, completely author-driven story. So here they tell these are arcs that represent people's lifespans and when they actually died from a gun-related incident. And then you see this over a bigger population. And at this point, this is all still completely author-driven. It's going for a while. And now now the author-driven piece is over, and you can actually start exploring the data yourself. You can hover, and they have actual names, like who is the person that was killed. It's John Thomas Brown, a 40-year-old man, was killed on Friday, July 5th in Hampton, Virginia. And they here links to the story. And then you can start faceting it, what is the proportion of females, and then you can see the juxtaposition of males versus females. What is the adults, or what is the group of children? When did they die? Here you see children versus adults. You can facet it by region and so on. So you start off with this automatic iteration, and then you give people the ability to really drill down into maybe something that they are particularly interested in. A second example here is this interactive slideshow. So this is budget forecast compared with reality. If you think about budget forecasts, I always feel like they're basically a linear interpolation of the current trend. And if you look at this story here, you will see that this is actually the case. So here it's we have the stepper, which is kind of the classical format. You see that we can have some narration here, and then we can click on next, and it moves to the next piece of the story. We have some annotation, some context of what happens. We have last year's forecast and latest forecast compared. And now we're we see much more information, but I can actually interact with this and see which of those forecasts, what were they and what did they actually forecast. And so you see that economists tend to be pretty optimistic all the time. And then you keep going and tell the story, and at any point you can interact. And so this kind of builds a bigger picture. And then finally, you have a drill down story here where there isn't really any preconceived story. So here, this is kind of this was around the financial crisis, and what's unique about this story, which you don't really see all that much, every single data point here is its own story. So there isn't really any structure about it, there isn't any order about it. You click, there's one highlighted, this is the current market back in 2009, but whenever you click on any of those lines, it will actually tell you a little story about what is the context of this particular depression, where does it fit in the bigger market, and you can do that for any of those events, or at least for most of those events you will have some information. So that's kind of a neat way, but it's also not here you have to rely on people actually playing around with it by themselves. The author has no control over what is it that you're seeing. Okay, so I want to review a couple of strategies for storytelling. We've seen all of this before, but I just it makes sense to think about this again. And this is true for storytelling, but all of this is also true for if you want to create a figure for a scientific publication. You definitely need descriptive titles, descriptive subtitles, annotations, and you need to work with saturation. So let me show you a couple of examples of how you can take the same chart basically and just apply those kinds of things to make a chart much more emphasize the point you want to make. So this is ice cream flavor preferences based on a 2014 survey of elementary school students. You see they like chocolate, and this chart shows all the data, right? Here's a redesigned chart that does a couple of things. So first, it emphasizes the key point by using contrast, right? The bar that people want you to care about is much darker and therefore will draw your attention. It stands out. And the title is much more descriptive as well. Here it is like completely neutral, as you might see it in a scientific journal. And here is chocolate was the most popular flavor. Basically, you get the interpretation and not just the description of what the data is. And then you still have like all of this contextual information that you need in a separate heading. Here's another piece. This is like about descriptive titles and saturation. So you have project results before and after implementation of a grant. You have like all the same data, but in this one case, what you really want to highlight is project A. And the title here says, instead of project results before and after implementation of grant, it says project A had the greatest gains after the 4-year grant funding. So like completely framing of like what is the actual message that they want to tell. And again, using contrast and saturation to emphasize the one point that you really want to make. Here is like another example for descriptive subtitles and annotations to increase understanding. You have like number of studies funded each year, or we're funding more studies each year. Beginning in 2013, we set aside new funding to measure effectiveness of our initiatives, and we evaluated 39 programs in 2015 alone. And so here, like you see that they kind of simplified this. They took off some of the points where you have the data points that are the support for the line chart, and really only show them now for where they want you to focus on, and they have in-chart annotations. Okay, so in terms of interactivity, there's a couple of things that you can do to tell convincing stories. The first one is about navigations, and so we talked a little bit about scrolling, storytelling, about steppers, about playing, forward, rewinding, and so on. We also talked about details on demand, like tooltips, highlighting things that when you want to. But one thing that we didn't really talk about is like a strategy that is, I think, like a very, very strong way of telling compelling data stories is to make it relevant to the reader. It's like very different from like if I see some graph that I don't really can relate to, then if I can really contextualize this from my own experience. What do you think? How does this compare to what actually is happening? Who are you? Where do you live? And so here's 2 examples for that. This is like this is an example from our OECD study, and like you can definitely criticize this visualization. This is about regional well-being, and what this tool uses, it actually uses your browser location to customize the visualization to your particular situation. And so this is about well-being in the United States, and I think also globally. And you can search for a region, so you can say, okay, let's look for Austria, my home state. But it also like automatically loaded, like if I just reload, well, I have it now the URL, but if I just go here, it will ask me like retrieving your location, and it seems like you're in Utah, go. And now I see this specifically for Utah, and I am much more likely to care about like this particular instance because it is where we live, right? And then you can drill down and find more information about that. Another example of something like this here is a New York Times piece from 2016 about how much warmer was your city. So this shows, New York Times shows by default for New York City. What you see here in the background is the light gray is the maximum and minimum temperatures on a certain day. In the dark red, in the darker light reddish background here, you see the typical range, and then you see the current year overlaid in the dark red. And what makes this kind of like neat is that you can put in your own city. So I can say Salt Lake City, Utah, and I can look at what was Salt Lake City like in 2015, right? And I can see, oh, here in June we had a heat wave, and that will relate to like my lived experience, because I might remember that this was a dreadful time because it was super hot. And notice that they do automatic annotations, right? So they have this for like lots of American cities, and they just like automatically annotate all of the record temperatures. So like this is a pretty smart way of making the story compelling, but also kind of like making it relevant to everybody in their market. Another way, which I think is even more engaging, or at least as engaging, is asking people for their own opinions. So if you want to make a point, it's often useful to first ask people, what do you think about this? And then show them what is the reality, what does the data tell us? And so there's two examples here. How family income predicts children's college chances. And here on the x-axis we have parents' income percentile and percent of children who attend college. Now it asks me to draw this here. And notice that they use sketchy rendering of the axis here to emphasize that this isn't all about, this isn't fact, right? This is something that you want to draw. So what should I draw here? What do you think? Like, I know it, but so I'm not going to draw my own. Somebody has to tell me what to draw. Who thinks that there's a linear relationship? Or is it completely flat? Or do we have some kind of more complicated sign?
Positive linear.
You just draw Batman.
Batman.
Ooh.
Well, okay, not very intelligent. Let's start over. Let's try like a linear relationship, or roughly linear. And now the cool thing is, like, I thought about this problem, right? And now I can kind of judge how this whole thing looks in reality. So basically, if they say not the worst, like it seems to be mostly a linear relationship. So college attendance is mostly linear, correlated with income. And what's even cooler is that they show you what everybody is thinking and drawing. So they collect data every time somebody draws, and then they show it in this heat map. And so you can see like how does, like, my guess wasn't all that much off, right? So a lot of people started here in the bottom corner instead of up here. So there's barely anybody who started up here. Here's another example of something like this. You can make predictions. Basically, this is like various factors in the Bush years and then in the Obama years. And so under President Obama, the unemployment rate, like we started off at 4%, and the Bush have a little like a bump and then down, and now we're at 6%. What should I draw here?
Spike up at 08, so the title says it's worse.
The title? What got better or worse? So I see somebody making like a wave. Try this. And then show me how I did. Didn't do all that bad, right? And then how does the number of immigrants convicted of crimes who were deported? What should I draw here?
It should be going up.
Going up, going down?
Yeah.
Going down. Just by your reactions, right? It seems to be pretty compelling. I have a hypothesis, and then I can see what the data is actually like. And so they have lots of other things, so you can play with those. But I find this to be like a super engaging way for doing like these data stories. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some design considerations for creating these data stories. So here's an example. This is about traffic for fatalities. The title here is "Fewer People Are Dying on U.S. Roads, but Seasonal Trends." Well, the title isn't particularly good, but seasonal trends are very apparent, right? So what we see here is a line chart. Here we have month and the number of fatalities. The lines are probably multiple years. Here's a different perspective on this with a color scale here. And then we have more specific charts here for selected holidays. Like January 1st, July 4th, and Christmas. So what do you think about this chart? It sucks. Okay, why does this chart suck?
I don't agree with because like I look at that and I'm like, nothing changed.
Yeah, nothing changed. You don't really see it. So the color scale here isn't well chosen, right? Any other comments? Yeah.
Aside from the big green block, it's mostly just white background, so it's hard to pick where I'm going to look at.
Yeah. Other comments?
I think your like center of attention is just towards the green block. And everything else.
Yes. So you have like this massive green block which draws your attention in, but it actually isn't all that interesting what you see here because the color scale is kind of off. So here's a redesign. It uses essentially the same methods, but uses fewer colors, averages for context, which is useful, better scales, and richer annotations. So let's see. This is I want to blow this up, or can't. No, I can't do it. So this is kind of like interesting now, right? Because you have like single years, and then you have the average of all years. So you have kind of a reference point here highlighted, and then we have like a diverging color scale where we use grayscale, and then red for highlighting particularly hard or the particularly fatal times seasonally. And so this kind of like emphasizes the peaks more than the background variation. And then you don't actually need color. Like here, you can't tell the years apart by color, right? So using color here is completely pointless. Simplifying it just makes a ton of sense. And similarly here, we have kind of like the scales were changed. We see the big change here much more clearly. This isn't the chart anymore that goes to 0. But again, like you need to choose charts. You need to choose your axis to show the data, not the 0 point, right? And then we have rich annotations here. Like we see there were 2,500 fatalities in August 2009. So this is like a fairly recent year. And this kind of like highlights the minimum point. And then we see like 2 other data points here annotated. So like same data, same basic charts, just a couple of little tunes to make this from like a pretty ugly chart to a pretty compelling data story. So how can we get people's engagements? Like first thing is that you need to really think about your audience, right? Like you have to tell stories specific to an audience. It depends like a lot. Are you giving a talk at a scientific conference? Are you writing? Are you creating a figure for a scientific journal, or is it for a popular science article, or is it for a general purpose newspaper? So you